Volvo has really been on a roll lately. They've been releasing multiple products a year, and over the last 4 years or so, they've completely replaced their lineup in America. That makes this 2019 Volvo XC90 the oldest design in their portfolio. But as you can see, the XC90 doesn't look old compared to the rest of the Volvo lineup, because this is the vehicle that set the tone for every Volvo that we've seen since, in terms of the overall front-end design, back-end design, and the side profile as well. Part of that is because I think that Volvo has really struck on a timeless design here, and the other reason is that this is the same design language that they've used in every other Volvo since. This design served as the building blocks not just for the XC60 and the XC40, but also for the S60, S90, and of course Volvo's wagons as well. So we get very similar grille designs in all of the lineup and headlamp designs as well. Now we know that for 2020 there are going to be some slight tweaks to the XC90. We will be driving that one hopefully very, very soon, but the changes on the outside are very, very minimal. That's because Volvo has decided to keep the XC90 definitely with this same theme, because all the other Volvos have this theme now, so they're really just going to be doing some very minor tweaks to the grille, possibly the headlamps. We should know very soon. You may be wondering, why are we taking a look at the XC90 again if it is so similar to the last model that we drove? The main reason is that we have a host of new competitors in this segment, like an all-new BMW X5, the X7 of course, the new Mercedes-Benz GLA, the GLS, and the Audi Q8. All of which I suppose you could call direct competitors to this XC90. And that's before we start taking a look at non-European options like the Cadillac XT6 and the upcoming and very tasty Lincoln Aviator. When it comes to number of seats, the XC90 lineup is a little bit confusing because it is still available as a 2 or a 3-row vehicle for 2019, although one of the 2-row options has been deleted. Previously, it started out with a 2-row option, seated 5, so 2 seats up front, 3 in the back, nothing in the way back. That particular option has been removed. So this will now start as a 7-passenger vehicle, 2 seats up front, 3 in the middle, and then 2 in the back. We are told that there will be for 2020 a 6-seat version available with captain's chairs in the middle instead of the bench, and then still 2 seats in the back. And then of course there's the very top end trim of the XC90, which gives us 2 seats in the back, refrigerator console, etc., and then 2 seats up front. So that seats only 4 people total. This particular model is the 7-seat version. While we're looking at the side, let's talk about what's going on up front. You'll notice that Volvo decided to give their latest vehicles a very rear-wheel drive looking proportion. We have this long hood up front. You can really see how long that hood is right there. And then we have a decent distance between the wheels and the front door. But the XC90 is still a front-wheel drive transverse-engined vehicle in its base format. And that's why we still have a little bit longer of an overhang between the very front of the vehicle and that front tire right there, although it has definitely been minimized in this generation. That gives the XC90 overall a presence that we typically find in the German rear-wheel drive vehicles, and very different than what we see in something like an Acura MDX or the Cadillac XT6. Out back, the classic Volvo strong hip design has been morphed into this particular shape that we see right here. Again, this is the origin of the latest Volvo designs. You can definitely see some of these elements working their way even into the sedan lineup. We get dual exhaust tips down there at the bottom, and as you can see by that badge over there on that side, this is the T6 model. By designing the engine bay only for this smaller 4-cylinder engine, Volvo was able to give this that more rear-wheel drive look overall. The base engine is a turbocharged version of that 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. It produces 250 horsepower. The T6, which is what we're driving here, adds a supercharger but does not remove the turbocharger to give you 316 horsepower total. It also makes this engine feel more like a larger naturally aspirated engine. The supercharger is here to give us low RPM torque, something that we don't generally find in turbocharged engines. The supercharger has the ability to give us boost at idle, and that's how you get the feeling of a larger displacement engine when you're taking off from a stoplight or a stop sign, etc. And then at higher engine RPMs, the turbocharger takes over to give you better overall efficiency. If you want even more power than this and better fuel economy, there's the T8 plug-in hybrid. That adds a hybrid system but does not remove the turbocharger or the supercharger, so it's a turbocharged, supercharged plug-in hybrid. Now, if you're shopping for the T8, you should know that for 2020, Volvo has said that the T8 system is going to get a battery upgrade. We don't know all the details about the battery, but you should expect that it's probably going to be larger in capacity, perhaps a little bit lighter than the current battery as well. So it's likely going to give you better range in that particular model. Also upcoming for 2020, but unfortunately not in the United States, is a standard hybrid system as well, rather than the plug-in hybrid that we get right now. Details are a little bit sketchy on that particular hybrid system, but there should be 2 variants of that hybrid, we're told, for Europe, and those are going to improve overall fuel economy but not give you plug-in range. It's likely only a matter of time until we see those systems in the United States. Volvo has long had a reputation for delivering some of the most comfortable seats in the industry, and that continues for the 2019 XC90. This particular seat design has a power extending thigh cushion, four-way adjustable lumbar support, and inflatable side bolsters as well. There's also a 3-position memory on the driver's side door and on the passenger side door because the passenger side has the exact same range of motion as the driver's side. However, I am going to have to knock these seats down to 9 out of 10 points because, oddly enough, I found the new seats in the X5 and the X7 to be just a hair more comfortable than these particular Volvo seats. Mainly it had to do with the amount of thigh support that we find in the X5 and X7. I found it just a little bit better for my body shape. It's also worth noting that the way that this 4-way lumbar support works is it has 3 air bladders in there, and each of the bladders can be inflated and deflated, so it doesn't give you quite the same range of motion for overall lumbar support as we find in some of the competition. We also still have a manual tilt telescopic steering column rather than a power steering column like we find in most of the luxury alternatives. But these are still definitely more comfortable than the seats that we find in the Q7, definitely more comfortable than the million-way adjusting seats even that we find in the current Lincoln portfolio. Those Lincoln seats are definitely adjustable, but that doesn't necessarily make them more comfortable than this seat design. With just under 110 inches of combined legroom, and that is front row plus second row plus third row, the XC90 is pretty spacious for this particular segment. It's very similar to the Discovery and the BMW X7. To fold the center seat position, we pull this little bit of webbing right here, and then the center seat folds forward completely independent of the outboard seating positions. That makes this an awful lot more flexible than some of the alternatives in this segment. You also have the option of moving this center seat forward on its own, and that's also something that we don't see in most of the competition. The reason you might want to do this is if you put a child seat here and you wanted the child seat to be a little bit closer to the driver or the front passenger. If you have a child that is in the booster seat phase of life, where you're not using a child seat but you are using a booster seat, a handy feature here is that we have an available one right there in the center seat position, so you don't have to have one hanging out in the vehicle. And if you want to put an adult there, you just simply pop that back into place. Now on the downside, it's worth noting that none of these second row seats can keep a child seat latched into place and give you access to the third row. Hopping into the third row is pretty easy. Remember that the outboard seats and the center seat move independently of one another, so that makes these a little bit lighter than some of the alternatives in the luxury segment. You'll notice that with the second row seat moved all the way rearward, my knees are definitely digging into that seat back. But because the second row slides forward and backward, I could easily apportion the space a little bit more equitably. But legroom is overall pretty generous, and we have some air vents back here. Overall parts quality definitely drops down behind the second row. The second row doors are impeccably finished, but back here the reality is that the third row is going to spend most of its time folded, so things are definitely oriented more towards the cargo side. We have integrated cup holders back here in the third row, some very small storage cubbies, and again those air vents for the rear passengers. Behind the third row seats, we find just under 16 cubic feet of storage space. That's a pretty healthy cargo area for the overall size of the XC90, and that puts this a little bit above something like the Audi Q7, which is notably bigger than this. We also have a little bit of extra storage space right here under the load floor, but it is a little bit oddly shaped. You can see it's somewhat triangular. The back end is an awful lot deeper than the front right there. That's because of the location of the spare tire. You'll see that it is right here at kind of a funny angle to the back. It's a donut spare tire, and then we have the tire iron right there in the middle. As we take a look at the interior, keep in mind that we are in the inscription trim, so there are features here that you won't find in the base model XC90, but this is not the very top end trim. This model has a large panoramic moonroof that extends to just over the second row passengers' heads, and you can see from this angle that the second row passengers have height adjustable shoulder belts just like the front row. Moving back to the front, we find height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, a nice touch that we don't find in all of the European options anymore for some reason. And then we have fixed height headrests. This has always made me scratch my head a little bit. Volvo tells us that these headrests were designed for a variety of different body sizes and shapes, and that a lot of folks don't adjust their headrest properly, so they designed a headrest that doesn't need to be adjusted. But I do wish that these moved at least vertically like we see in the XC40. This model sports these attractive brown leather seats. They're perforated because they're heated and ventilated. We have moderate bolstering on the sides and bottom cushion, and from this angle you can see that extending thigh cushion. When this generation of the XC90 first launched, the main thing that people noticed was the overall interior design. Not just the look, but also the quality of the parts. This interior, especially in the upper end trims of the XC90, really is world class. This definitely has the ability to stand toe-to-toe with the top end versions of the BMW X7 or even perhaps a Mercedes-Benz GLS. There's a ton of stitched material going on the front doors. The rear doors are finished basically the same as the front doors, and then we have a full stitched dashboard as well with more real wood trim down there at the bottom. This particular model has the up-level Bowers & Wilkins sound system. It is an expensive option, but one that I would probably get if I got the XC90. We have this very distinctive center channel speaker right here in the middle of the dashboard, but Volvo decided to steer clear of some of the speaker grill theatrics that we see in the competition. So nothing pops up out of the dashboard, nothing spins or anything like that when you turn on the vehicle. Working our way down the dashboard, again, we have another view of the stitched leather dashboard and all the various design elements going on here. And then in the very center of things, we have this tablet-style touchscreen infotainment system. This is basically the same software and the same touchscreen that we find in every modern Volvo in America right now. There are two large air vents on each side, but you can see that the overall design is a little bit different than what we see in Volvo's sedan lineup. If you experienced this infotainment system in some of the earlier XC90s, then you should know that this system has a faster processor than that previous model. So therefore, this is definitely more responsive than that first generation of this same system. So for instance, as I click around all these various screens, you'll notice that this is definitely much snappier in responding, but it is not as snappy as, for instance, the latest Tesla infotainment systems or some of the competitive infotainment systems out there. For instance, the Mercedes Command System and BMW's iDrive, they're definitely a little bit snappier than this depending on what you want to do. But the Volvo system is pretty intuitive. We swipe left or right for various system functions. They've separated these functions a little bit logically here. So we swipe from the left to the right for things like vehicle functions. That's where we find the camera, the autonomous parking, heads-up adjustment, fold the headrests for the rear passengers right back there, lane keeping aid, auto start, stop, etc. You can also turn on and off the heads-up display, blind spot monitoring system. We can change the way the headlights work, whether or not we want the corners illuminated, whether we want them to turn in the corners. And then if we're at the home screen and we swipe the other way, this is where we find more entertainment-focused options like AM, FM, the sources there. You can adjust the sound experience. Interestingly enough, this is also where we find things like car status. We also get options like driver performance right here, so you can see our fuel consumption, how that's been over our time in the vehicle, and we can adjust preferences as well. This side is also where we'll find Volvo integrated apps. So these are running on this system itself. These are not cell phone integrated apps. For instance, we could use the Google integrated app to find things near us, accommodations, restaurants, that sort of thing, recent places, more things that are accounted for there in the Google library. That's integrated into the system, and then it would use the vehicle's navigation to interact with those. You can, of course, use Apple CarPlay as well if that's something that you're interested in. And then Android Auto is also available in this system now. You can see we have that option that was not available initially at the launch of the XC90, but it is available now. Volvo also offers over-the-air updates in this system, so you can see it's searching for those updates right now. If there was one, we'd be able to go ahead and install that. Climate control functions are handled by these touch options right down here for the driver and passenger. If I click on over to this option, we have a little bit more going on there. Parking climate, main climate, and then we can, of course, adjust the rear zone climate as well, or the third row climate controls where we enable or disable them. That just turns on and off the vents. The second row climate we can enable and disable and then adjust the two rear zones, since this does have 4-zone climate control. Below the infotainment screen, we find some of the only physical buttons available in this vehicle: hazard light, defogger, defroster, track forward and backward, a volume knob right here that also acts as play pause right there in the center, and then a button to open and close the glove compartment. The glove compartment is one of the bin variety. I was definitely able to fit a larger tablet computer in there. There's also a very small storage shelf just above where you can put things like smartphones or smaller items. Below that button bank, we find a pretty traditional console shifter. This does change if you get the plug-in hybrid model. It becomes a digital joystick style shifter. Drive is all the way back like that. Manual mode over to the left. We push away from the driver for gear up. If I just go ahead and put this in neutral temporarily, you'll see this little storage cubby right up front there. This moves like that, and then we pull this roller shade style cover back. That reveals this large cup holder area where we can put 2 large drinks, a smaller square area where I suppose you could put something like a juice box, and then we have a 12-volt power port. To the left of that area, we find the start-stop toggle for the engine. We then have a drive mode toggle. We can click down and then use the infotainment screen to adjust your drive mode, or you can roll that along right there and choose the drive mode from the available options on the screen. We have an electric parking brake right here, and then a button to enable and disable the auto brake hold system. The center console has a padded armrest right there in the middle. From this angle, you can see the controls for the rear climate control zones. If I go ahead and hit that, you can see that we can adjust each of those zones independently of one another. And then we have 2 air vents right there behind. There are also some air vents in the B pillar. We have a leather-covered armrest that opens to reveal a fairly small storage area right there. That's because there's a lot of that plumbing for the 4-zone climate control running right here in that armrest. You can see I can definitely put a larger smartphone in there, however. The center console is also where we find the dual USB inputs for that infotainment system. On the driver's side, we have a full LCD instrument cluster. This doesn't change views as we see in something like the current Audi lineup, but we do have a moving map display right there in the middle. The display also changes if we choose the Eco Drive mode. You'll notice instead of a tachometer, we get this Eco mode display right there. And then we have a pop-up for our trip computer information, media information, phone, and navigation right there. So although it's a full LCD, it's not quite as configurable as what we see in some of the modern alternatives. The steering wheel is a round design, but we have sport grips up top. There are a few different trims that you can choose when you're ordering your XC90. On the left side of the wheel, we have the controls for the cruise control system. We can toggle between adaptive cruise control and pilot assist with these left-right buttons, and then increase and decrease the distance with these toggles right over here. On the right side of the wheel, we have the infotainment buttons, track forward, backward, volume up and down. There's a voice command button, and then this button pops up that little display right there in the instrument cluster. Out on the road, you'll definitely notice the low-end torque out of this engine thanks to the supercharger. Some folks will also notice the supercharger whine and, of course, the 4-cylinder engine noises. Some folks are bothered by that, but for me, it didn't really make too much of a difference. Honestly, lower displacement engines like this are definitely where the entire segment is going, and a decent number of the competition now has 4-cylinder engines in their base models as well, or 4-cylinder engines in some of their hybrid models. 6.4 seconds 0 to 60 is definitely not as swift as something like the brand new BMW X5 with its 3-liter inline 6, but it's still pretty decent for this category, and it's just faster than something like the Infiniti QX60. It also managed to be a hair faster than the last model that we tested. I suspect that's because this particular model is a little bit lighter. It doesn't have all of the options that last XC90 had. In our braking test, we stopped from highway speeds back to 0 in 114 feet. That's definitely a big improvement over the last XC90 that we tested, even though this particular model doesn't weigh that much less. I suspect that Volvo went back to the drawing board and tweaked a few things to help improve overall braking performance. The model that we're driving has wide 275 width tires on it. Those are pretty wide for this segment overall, whether we're talking about front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive biased entries. But these tires are not high-performance summer tires. They're not high-performance all seasons either. And that's likely why overall stopping distance is not as short as some of the competition when they're equipped with those higher performance tires. It also is likely the reason that overall road holding falls behind some of the competition as well. Acura's MDX, thanks to its torque vectoring all-wheel drive system, does very well in power-on situations, but I think that the XC90 does better when it comes to neutral handling. I also think that this has a more engaging feel overall than the current generation Audi Q7. The XC90 is more fun than you might suspect. That's why I'm going to give this an A- when it comes to handling. Out on a rougher gravel road like this, the firmer suspension tune in the XC90 is really obvious. Now, this particular model has the standard steel spring suspension, not the adaptive air suspension that we've usually tested every time we've had the XC90 so far. The optional air suspension is a standalone option, and that's definitely something that I prefer in the XC90. It really softens things up. It also gives us the ability to have a little bit more ground clearance when you need it. And the air suspension is an adaptive design, so it can firm things up when you want to, and it can soften things out when you want a slightly more comfortable ride as well. This firm suspension design has surprised a few people that have test driven the XC90 and commented over at facebook.com/AlexandAutos, but remember that the XC90 is targeting a European audience as well, and they generally seem to like a suspension that's a little bit firmer. Remember that the XC90 also has fairly low profile tires, so those aren't going to give you quite as much cushion as some of the higher profile designs. So if you're taking a look at a base XC90, it may feel a little bit different out on a rougher road like this than some of the higher end trims with the bigger wheel packages. Thanks to the wide tires and the suspension design, the XC90 has a very confident feel to it out on the road, and I suspect overall grip would seriously improve if you swapped out these tires for some grippier all seasons or summer tires. Like most of the European competition, this vehicle uses a double wishbone suspension up front, not a McPherson strut suspension like we find in most of the Japanese or American competition. In our cabin noise test on this particular road surface, we got 70 decibels at 50 miles an hour. But on the road surface that we usually test the XC90 on, this came in at 72. The difference is the road surface itself. Wind noise is very well controlled in the XC90, but thanks to the 275 with tires, I suspect we definitely get a little bit more road noise into the cabin. When it comes to our overall cabin noise score, I'm going to have to give this a B-, because the current generation X5, X7, GLS, and GLE are all very, very quiet out on the road. And they have tires that are just about as wide as the model that we're driving here. Over a week of mixed driving, we've been averaging 22.5 miles per gallon, which is a little bit above what the EPA says we should be getting in this particular all-wheel drive model. That number is pretty respectable for a 3-row crossover with over 300 horsepower on tap, but you should know that some of the turbocharged 6-cylinder options out there will go faster 0 to 60 than this and get fairly similar overall fuel economy. Now, if you're really treating this gently, you will get better fuel economy in our tests than something like an X5, but the X5 is significantly faster than this, and driven the way I think the average person drives, the two vehicles are going to be pretty similar in terms of overall fuel economy. If you want better fuel economy and better performance, there is of course the XC90 T8, and I give that model an A+ when it comes to fuel economy, because it gives us a combination of 400 horsepower under the hood, definitely swift acceleration out of that plug-in hybrid system. We also get a plug-in hybrid EV range, and fuel economy that's pretty similar to the Lexus RX Hybrid, and it's definitely way faster than that Lexus. The XC90 has aged pretty well overall, but I have to say that there's definitely very stiff competition in this segment. The new X5 and the new GLE are fast, they're quiet, they're efficient, and they're a little bit more comfortable out on the road. Now, that doesn't mean that the XC90 is a bad choice in this particular segment, but it does mean that there's an awful lot of tough competition. I'm going to make the pricing and comparison section a little short here because the 2020 XC90 is coming very soon, and I have been invited to drive it. You'll see that video happening just a few weeks after you see this one on our channel. For the moment, the Momentum starts at $48,395. That is more than something like an Acura MDX, but it's an awful lot less than the European competition. If you want the model that we were driving this week, that is the Inscription model that gets you the nicer dashboard components, the wood trim on the inside, etc., the upgraded interior materials, that'll set you back at least $62,995. And if you want all of the bells and whistles on your XC90, then you want the Excellence trim that starts at $105,545. The XC90 is this odd blend of Q7, X5, MDX competitor, and then in that top-end Excellence trim, they're trying to target customers that would normally shop for a Range Rover. I definitely think the XC90 has the exterior presence and design to compete with the Range Rover lineup. It certainly has an absolutely excellent interior in that top-end Excellence trim, but the performance and perhaps the brand is not quite in line with where we see most Land Rover and Range Rover shoppers. Be sure and let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below. With that out of the way, let's dive right into the comparisons that everybody over at facebook.com/AlexandAutos wanted me to make. The first one is the Audi Q7. For a number of reasons, the Q7 and the Volvo are very commonly cross-shopped in America. Both are definitely family-focused vehicles. Both of them are a little bit less expensive than the other European entries, and both of them start with 2-liter 4-cylinder engines. The big thing to know about the Q7 is that it is getting a very significant refresh for 2020, whereas the XC90 is getting a very mild refresh for 2020. So a lot of what we've talked about in this video is going to apply directly to the 2020 XC90, but very little of what I'm going to talk about here with the Q7 is going to apply to the 2020 Q7 because it's getting an almost entirely new interior, and that does look really tasty. If you haven't seen it, then I would definitely check that out on Audi's website. But for the moment, the 2019 Q7 comes across to me as a little bit plain Jane, a little bit boring. That's something that a lot of folks have said about this generation of the Q7. In some ways, it really is the Audi minivan. But then again, the X5, the X7, the GLE, the GLS, and the XC90 are all the respective family haulers for their brands. But the Q7, for some reason, just feels a little bit more plain, for the lack of a better word there. On the other hand, if you're looking for style that's a little bit more simple and a roomy interior, the Q7 is going to be an excellent option. It's just not going to handle quite as well as the XC90. Volvo's really done an awful lot of work with their platform to improve handling, so even though it does start out as a front-wheel drive vehicle and the Q7 has a longitudinal design, the Q7 doesn't actually handle better than the XC90. At the moment, I think value is also a bit of a problem for the Q7. The interior doesn't feel quite as premium as the XC90, but it's going to be more expensive. It starts at $53,000, which is about $5,000 higher than the Volvo. Now, I think that problem is going to be fixed for 2020, but for 2019, it definitely applies to the Q7. Moving along, we have the BMW X5, which I have to say is one of my current favorites in this segment. The new X5 interior is absolutely excellent. Some people have complained that the exterior was at the once a little bit too plain and that perhaps the grille was a little bit too big on the front. But overall, I think that the X5 gets just about everything right. Performance in the base model is absolutely excellent. The interior design and interior finishings are very, very well done. And the latest version of iDrive is pretty easy to use overall as well. Regardless of how you configure it, the X5 is going to be more expensive than the Volvo. Now, remember when comparing the X5 to the Volvo that the Volvo appears to be a lot less expensive, but if you want the same kind of performance in the XC90 that we find in the base X5, you do have to step up to the T6 all-wheel drive. And that's going to be right around $57,000, so that closes that gap considerably. But the base X5 is going to be rear-wheel drive, not all-wheel drive. If you want to add that, that does cost a little bit extra. And any way you slice it, the X5 is going to be thousands of dollars more than the Volvo. And that delta will grow the more equipment you put on the X5. Now, is the extra cash worth it on the X5? I might argue that it is, because I really like the way that the interior is done in the BMW. But for a lot of folks out there, that difference is going to be a pretty big deal. And when it comes to overall value, unquestionably the XC90 wins here. I like the overall interior design of the XC90 a little bit more than the X5, but I think I like some of the parts quality in the X5 better, especially in those very top-end trims. Perhaps the biggest shocker for the X5 was the overall comfort of the front seats. Personally, I found the X5 seats to be more comfortable than the XC90, and that surprised me a little bit because Volvo has generally had among the most comfortable seats in the luxury segment. But I think that for 2019 and 2020, both the X5 and the Mercedes-Benz GLA managed to have more comfortable front seats. And that brings us along to the Mercedes-Benz GLA. A lot of what I just said about the X5 applies to the GLA as well. I don't like the interior styling quite as much as the XC90, but interior parts quality, especially in the top-end trims, I think is a little bit higher than in the Volvo. But you're going to pay for that extra quality. The GLA is considerably more expensive than the base version of the XC90. And then if you step on up to the model with their new inline-six engine and the mild hybrid system, it is going to be a lot more expensive than the XC90. Depending on exactly how you have the Volvo and the Mercedes-Benz equipped, the delta could be up to $10,000. And it's worth noting that for the price of some of the mid-level GLE trims, you could get the T8 plug-in hybrid in the XC90, their 400 horsepower plug-in hybrid system. That's going to allow you access to the carpool lanes in California. It's also going to give you the best acceleration in the XC90 and the best fuel economy. And it's going to come with a $7,500 federal tax credit and certain applicable state and local incentives. So you could get an awful lot more power and more fuel economy for less than the GLE. That is the big deal when you take a look at the XC90 versus the GLE. But again, the GLE has a lot of things going for it. I think it's very attractive on the inside and on the outside. I don't like the styling quite as much as the XC90, but it's still a gorgeous vehicle. And they have a lot of their fancier new features in the XC90. So for instance, we get the new MBUX infotainment system. But if you want all the snazzy features on M-Bucks, then you do have to upgrade to some fairly expensive packages to get the gesture control and the augmented video, etc. That's going to cost you an awful lot more than just the base GLE, but the system is very, very well done. As with the X5, there are definitely some reasons that you might want to get the GLE over the XC90, but value is probably not one of those reasons because the Volvo is unquestionably the better value. And speaking of value, let's talk about the Acura MDX, a vehicle that is frequently compared to the Volvo, but not necessarily the other European options. Obviously, a lot of that has to do with brand positioning. Volvo doesn't have a brand that is considered in the same league necessarily as the Mercedes-Benz lineup or the BMW lineup in many ways. But it's also a step above what we see in the Acura lineup. We get a lot more luxury features in the Volvo lineup, more expensive models. We get a lot more nice touches going on there than we see in the Acura lineup. So that puts Volvo in kind of an in-between position between these two brands. And as you'd expect, overall value also ends up in between because the MDX starts considerably less than the XC90 and it will go nowhere near the top end price of the XC90 either. In fact, an absolutely fully loaded MDX really only takes you to the middle of the pricing lineup in the Volvo. Acura offers just one engine and one transmission in the MDX, so we get a decent amount of standard power, but the 9-speed automatic is a little bit controversial. Depending on exactly the version of the competition you're driving, the MDX is going to outhandle the XC90 and outhandle the Q7, even though the MDX has skinnier tires, because it can put a little bit more power to the rear. But does that mean that the MDX is the best handling and best dynamic vehicle overall in this segment? No, I wouldn't say that. The BMW X5 and the Mercedes GLA, I prefer the way that they drive over the MDX. And I also think that the XC90 has a more relaxed driving nature than the MDX. So I tend to prefer the way the XC90 feels out on the road versus the MDX, even though there are situations where the MDX will outhandle the XC90. But the big difference is going to be price and value. Price tag is much lower on the MDX, so as you'd expect, the interior feels less premium. We also get Acura's older infotainment system. They haven't updated that to the new one that we see in the RDX just yet. Rumor mill is telling us that we should be seeing an update to the MDX coming here very soon, but we don't exactly know when that's going to be. Acura seems to be focused on bringing out some of their more performance-oriented models first, and then they will likely refresh or redesign the MDX. It's probably going to get the infotainment system that we see in the RDX. It may even get the RDX's engine, and then likely a more powerful engine than what we see in the current generation model, to better help it compete with the rest of the European entries. It's probably also going to have a higher price tag. But I think if my money were on the line, I would probably buy the BMW X5 with the inline-six engine. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below. If you were shopping in this segment, what would you pick? Especially if you were shopping right around $50,000 to $55,000. I think that's the best area for comparing the XC90 with the competition, because you get a lot more content in the XC90 for that $55,000 to $60,000 range than you do in the competition. But the competition may be a little bit more fun, maybe a little bit faster 0 to 60. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Be sure and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so. And of course, click that join button down there at the bottom of your screen as well. I'll see you next week.